Welcome to our WISH Winter Seminar, which will be presented by Dr. Lin Bian from the University of Chicago. My name is Lise Elliott. I'm co-chair of the WISH, the Women in Science and Healthcare Committee, and professor of neuroscience here at Rosalind Franklin University. I want to just begin by shouting out to our outstanding administrative team, my co-chairs, Susie Calkins and Christine Burgess, as well as the outstanding staff you see to the right. We could not do this without them. It's quite an orchestration to have our outstanding professional work, so thank you for your assistance. This session does qualify for continuing education credits. The planners and speakers of this activity have no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose, and all of the relevant financial relationships listed for the faculty have been mitigated. Okay, so at this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lin Bian, who, as I said, is assistant professor of psychology at nearby University of Chicago. This is the second in our series of the Women in Science and Healthcare Symposia, which began, many of you joined us in September with Amy Deal's seminar on gender roles, and we had a wonderful panel discussion redefining gender roles in science and healthcare. So in that tradition, we wanted to take a deeper dive and talk about if these gender roles have such impact, where are they coming from, to learn about the developmental origins. And fortunately, we have one of the world's experts right nearby to help us understand this. So Dr. Bian is originally from Beijing and received her bachelor's in psychology with highest honors from Zhejiang University, which is one of the top universities in China, located near Shanghai. She then came right here to Illinois, to the University of Illinois, for her PhD, where she worked with this incredible developmental psychology department at Champaign-Urbana, including her advisor, Andre Simpian, and co-advisor, Renee Bayer-Jean. She did a short postdoctoral stint at Stanford with Ellen Markman, and then was recruited away to Cornell to the Department of Human Development, where she was assistant professor for 2 years before being lured once again to the University of Chicago, where she's been since 2021. Her research is currently supported by 2 NIH grants, including its very prestigious Career Award. She also received the Boyd McCandless Young Scientist Award from the American Psychological Association in 2024 and was named one of Forbes magazine's 30 scientists under 30 in 2019. She has published 28 peer-reviewed articles with many more about to come out, and her work is of such high profile that she's been interviewed by dozens of media outlets, including New York Times, the BBC, the Washington Post, CNN. It's really remarkable, but the one that stuck with me was The Onion, has apparently covered her work, which we know is the highest quality journalism. Dr. Bian has been invited to speak around the world and at seemingly every prestigious university in the US, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Princeton, and now, of course, Rosalind Franklin University. We're very fortunate to have her here to come speak on this topic related to gender roles, to present her seminar, Gender Stereotypes About Who Can Be Brilliant, Developmental Origins, Impact, and Interventions. So without further ado.
Thank you so much, Lise. That was like very lovely and generous introduction. And I'm just so glad to be here. So as we all know, women are underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which we call the STEM domain. So when I did a Google search, these days, and then when I Google like most famous scientists, this is what Google told me. And basically, as you can see, among this collection of scientists, most of the people represented are men. And it was very hard to see female faces, and indeed, there were only 4 of them. And Rosalind Franklin was one of them. And then you might wonder, well, these are historical figures. Maybe the gender disparity only show up in the past, and then maybe the disparity has disappeared in today's world. So I did another Google search, and I intentionally put in like today in the search, And what you can see is the photos are more, there are more colors in these photos, not just black and white. But still, only 3 women were represented in this collection. So women's underrepresentation remains to be a prominent and severe type of social disparity in our society. But in addition to this broader pattern that women generally are underrepresented in STEM, if you break down women's representation within the non-STEM domain, within the STEM domain, actually you see a lot of variations. So in fact, so the y-axis is the percent of female PhDs. And then you can see they are like different STEM disciplines on the x-axis. And women are underrepresented in some STEM disciplines, such as computer science and physics. But at the same time, they are well represented in molecular biology, evolutionary biology. And I also did the same analysis of the healthcare professions. And these are also like the percent of female PhDs. And as you can see, you see a similar variation. So women are well represented in nursing sciences like nutrition and also nutrition, but they are underrepresented in some other like healthcare disciplines. So basically, like we focus on women's underrepresentation in STEM, but at the same time, we should also consider these variabilities in women's representation. And in my work, we try to explain these 2 patterns together. And having this broader view will help us to understand the mechanisms giving rise to this like complex representations of women across different professions and across different academic fields. So in our theory, we propose 2 components come into play to shape women's representation. And the first component is this pervasive idea that men are more likely than women to be brilliant or intellectually gifted. So this gender stereotype associating brilliance with men more than women are prevalent, at least in adults' mind. But these stereotypes are consequential when it's combined with this idea that some jobs, some opportunities, or some environments, they seems to require a spark of genius for people to be successful. Like, for example, when you think about mathematics or computer science, people hold this idea that you need to have a spark of genius to be a successful mathematician or to be a highly like reputable computer scientist. And this message goes beyond the STEM domain and can transmit to some other fields, like, for example, in philosophy and economics, people also think you need to have the spark of genius. So, but when women encounter the fields or like professions or jobs that set as requiring brilliance, maybe they are more vulnerable to this message because of the gender stereotype against their intellectual talents. So they might feel like they don't belong to this environment, or like maybe people in these fields will display some biases against women. So we propose the combination of these 2 factors leads to the current pattern of women's underrepresentation. So in my talk today, I'm going to, Okay, so in my talk today, I'll present some evidence to show like the gender stereotypes about brilliance undermine women's participation. And then I'll present some evidence with like very young children, 5 to 8-year-olds, and then to show these gender stereotypes may emerge early and also the consequences take roots early. So starting with how the stereotype may influence women's participation, we propose there are at least 2 pathways for women to suffer from this like gender brilliance stereotype. One is that the stereotype may undermine women's own interest and motivation to pursue certain areas or like the opportunities that set as requiring brilliance. And to test this possible mechanism, we first introduced about 200 undergrads to this like hypothetical scenario. So we asked them to imagine that they are interested in applying for like internship programs. But then the participants, when they heard this is a novel opportunity, but then half of the undergrads heard, to be good at this, to get into this internship program, you need to be intellectual firecracker, at ease with complex abstract ideas, and have sharp mind. So half of them heard this internship placed a strong emphasis on intellectual talents. And for the other half, we said you need to have great focus and determination, put a lot of effort into everything they do, and be someone who never gives up. So you can see, like in the other condition, we call the dedication condition, means that we don't emphasize brilliance, but then we talk about hard work and commitment. And the reason we focus on hard work is because, working hard and putting like effort, it's an essential ingredient for like success in many careers and in many domains. So we thought this will be like a natural comparison to have. And after hearing about the internship program, like in the corresponding condition, we measured participants' interest to pursue this internship program. So we asked, how interested would you be in finding out more about this particular internship program? So then, and they were like, in addition to these questions, we also ask about, imagine if you are in the internship program, how likely do you want to turn this internship to a long-term career? So basically, we assess their interest comprehensively. And then because of the gender stereotype associating brilliance with men more than women, so women would be less interested to pursue the internship set as requiring brilliance than dedication. But for men, maybe they would be interested in pursuing like any internship programs because they don't face this gender brilliance stereotype. Okay, so now I'll show you the results from the study. On the y-axis are the interest score, and their interest towards the brilliance internship are in gold, and then their interest towards dedication are in gray. So as you can see, indeed, we found some differences in men's and women's interest towards this internship program. So for women, as you can see, once we described the internship as requiring brilliance, women were less interested in pursuing it compared to the dedication program. But then for men, there was no difference in their interest levels. Okay. So this pattern, women's lower interest towards the brilliance internship program was then later replicated in a variety of contexts. So these are the data I showed you just now, about 200 undergrads learning about an internship program. But then we also presented another group of participants and saying there is a novel, like a new STEM major. So the university has just announced a new major, but we didn't specify the content of the major. And then we described the major as either requiring brilliance or dedication. And we found women were less interested to pursue this like STEM major that's set as requiring brilliance. And we also presented a novel non-STEM major. So we said there is a major in social science and humanities, which is the field that women tend to be, overrepresented in general. But then as you can see, once you describe a major as requiring brilliance, women are actually less interested in pursuing that. And we also presented this, this new opportunity, but we didn't specify whether it's in STEM or non-STEM, and then still we replicated this pattern. So overall, of the gender brilliance stereotype, and then women are less interested to pursue activities set as requiring brilliance. Okay, so coming back to this pattern that I just showed you, just now, if we compare this pattern in a different way, like comparing men's and women's interest towards each type of internship, you can see that actually men and women are equally interested in this dedication internship. But then men are more interested in the internship set as requiring brilliance than women. So you may wonder, well, does it have anything to do with some other potential gender differences? Like, for example, maybe men are just less modest compared to women, so then they are more likely to feel like they are very brilliant and they want to claim they are interested in this like brilliance internship. And we found actually that's not the case. Even after we control for gender difference in modesty, we still saw this pattern. And we also control for like potential gender differences in their desired social status. And we still saw these gender differences. So where does this gender difference, between men's and women's interest towards the brilliance, where does it come from? Does it have anything to do with the gender brilliance stereotype? So then in our like further analysis, we measured people's endorsement of this gender brilliance stereotype, and we found the more they internalize the stereotype, and then we see like more of a gender difference in their interest towards the brilliance job. Okay. Yes.
I'll repeat my question. So I asked if you thought about adjusting for people's perception of whether people think of them as brilliant is in their control, right? Because women may be more likely to think, I can control how hard I work, but I can't control how others perceive me as brilliant or not because of that internalized.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the work by Carol Dweck, so she has this fabulous research on like fixed mindset versus growth mindset about intellectual abilities. So fixed mindset means that when we see intelligence, we think that's something that's fixed and unchangeable. And also regardless of how much practice you put into that, your intelligence is fixed. So out of our control. And like growth mindset means that we can always grow our intelligence with more practice. So actually in one of our experiments in the same paper, we manipulated like how people think about like brilliance, like whether it's fixed versus something you can change. And we found the manipulation didn't really help women to feel more motivated about the brilliance jobs. So regardless whether it's like fixed or like growable, and then women are just in general less interested. They are being discouraged by these brilliance messages. So it might be like in addition to like thinking about whether brilliance is fixed or not, they are also thinking about the culture that the brilliance message may be associated with. So maybe they are thinking this could be a more masculine culture, and then they don't enjoy like working in these environments. Yeah, excellent question. Okay. So this is one potential pathway where we see like the brilliance messages discourage women's own interest. But this is not the only way or like the only mechanism that that leads to women's underrepresentation. Another also important potential way to undermine women's participation is that even though sometimes women are motivated and they want to pursue these areas, but then they are being excluded because they face like stronger discrimination or biases from the practitioners of these fields. So next study will focus on the potential, like the biases and discrimination that may be presented in these brilliance domains. So again, we tested about like more than 300 adults, and for these participants, we asked them to imagine that they are working in the human resource department of a big company, and the big company is looking to fill a couple of positions in their workforce. So their job is to nominate some potential candidates for these companies. But before the nomination, they were again randomly assigned into one of two conditions. So in one condition, the participants heard that in order to be, so the type of people they are looking for are like having high IQs, superior reasoning skills, so highly brilliant. But then participants in the dedication condition heard the ideal candidates should be highly motivated. And after hearing the job descriptions, then they were asked to recommend like two acquaintances for these positions. So we asked them like, what is the age of the candidate, and what is the gender of the candidate, and what's the first name of the candidate. So we collected a bunch of the information, but we were only interested in the gender of the nominated candidate in their recommendations. So then we coded the gender of the nominated candidate, and we predict that people would demonstrate more bias against women in the brilliance than in the dedication condition, meaning that they would recommend or nominate fewer women for the brilliance job than for the dedication job. So here on the y-axis is the proportion of women being nominated. And as you can see, indeed, we found a condition difference. So people were less likely to recommend women for this brilliance job than for the dedication job. And in fact, if you look at the absolute values, like what is the percentage of women being nominated for the brilliance job, actually it's below chance. So in general, like people tend to recommend fewer women than men for the job set as requiring brilliance. Okay, so now I've presented some evidence showing that women are underrepresented in areas requiring brilliance. And one crucial factor that result in this lowered participation is because of this social stereotype associating brilliance with men. So next, because of the stereotypes are very pervasive, so it's likely that they don't just exist in adults' mind. And maybe young children are already sensitive to cultural messages about who is likely to be brilliant. And then they have already internalized these ideas and also influenced by these ideas. So in the next part, I'll focus on the developmental roots of gender gaps. And the first question we ask is, when do this gender brilliance stereotype develop? So do we see its development in early childhood? And if so, does the gender stereotype also influence young girls' interests and motivation, and also leads to biases against the young girls? So starting with the developmental trajectory of the gender brilliance stereotype. In our very first study, we tested 96 participants, 5 to 7-year-olds, and this is the age range where children they begin to have some initial social beliefs about about different social categories. So then we tested 5 to 7, and then we designed some tasks to assess their ideas about which gender is really, really smart, which is a child-friendly way of talking about brilliance. And we also measured their ideas about who is really, really nice. So nice is used as a control characteristic because it's very familiar to children at this age. They often talk about the teacher is really nice to me, and my friend, I'm nice to my friend. So nice is a trait that they are familiar with. But at the same time, niceness is now stereotypically associated with men more than women. So we wanted to see if children already have some gendered ideas about who is really smart versus who is really nice. I'll give you some examples of the tasks we used. So we had a gender-neutral story task where we told children a story about a really, really smart person. So we describe a person at the place where I work, and then we say this person is really special, this person is really smart. They figures out how to do things quickly and comes up with answers much faster and better than anybody else. But as you may realize, the gender of the person was unspecified. And then after hearing the story, we showed them 4 pictures, 2 men and 2 women, and we asked them, can you tell me who is the person in the story? So we looked at whether they picked a man or a woman as being the person in the story. And we also invited children to play a guessing game. And in this game, we showed them a bunch of pictures, one after another. And some pictures showed 2 people of the same gender, and some pictures showed a man and a woman like this one. And after showing each picture, we said, one of these 2 is a really, really smart person, and I wonder which one is really, really smart. So we looked at whether they picked the man or the woman as being really, really smart. So across all the tasks, we looked at whether the proportion of questions in which they pick their own gender as being really smart. And I'll show the results. So the y-axis are the proportion of choosing their own gender as being really smart. Boys are in blue, girls are in red. And this is what we found. So I'll walk you through the graph. At the age of 5, as you can see, both boys and girls pick their own gender as being really smart. 70% of the times, and then girls chose women and boys chose men as being really smart. And what you can see is that boys remain pretty much the same at the age of 6 and 7. They were still pretty confident in their own gender's intellectual talents. But then girls became less likely to do so at the age of 6 and 7. So they became less likely to choose women as being really, really smart and compared to boys' selections of men. So looking at the girls' data only, you may think, well, maybe girls were just being modest and they just don't want to attribute very positive traits to their own gender. So then we looked at children's selections of who is really, really nice, and we found the flipped pattern. As you can see, at the age of 6 and 7, actually girls were more likely to attribute niceness to their own gender compared to boys. So overall, when you're considering these two patterns together, this suggests that children begin to internalize this gender brilliance stereotype around the age of 6 and 7. So this gender brilliance stereotype emerged early. And then we also wanted to look at the sources of their gender brilliance stereotype. Like, why do they think boys are smarter than girls? So we thought maybe one factor or like one observation they could use is to look at who gets better grades in school. So because school achievement is often a proxy that people use to indicate intellectual talents. So then we asked children two follow-up questions. One is, who do you think gets better grades in school? And who do you think is first in their class? And with each question, we showed them 4 pictures, 2 boys and 2 girls, and they had to pick one out of the 4 as like this, and then they chose one to answer the question. And we looked at whether children chose their own gender as having better grades in school. And this is what we found. So as you can see across all 3 age groups, girls were more likely than boys to pick their own gender as having better grades in school. And this is pretty consistent with the reality, because in elementary schools, often the girls are doing better than boys on grades, on like school achievements. So children acknowledge that, and they are aware of that. But this pattern is very different from the one we saw when we asked children who is really smart. So even though like girls perceive girls as having better grades in school, but still children were choosing boys as being, or like men as being really, really smart. So there was some disconnection between these 2 sets of beliefs. Like in our analysis, we found no relation between these 2 sides of beliefs. Okay. So children's awareness of school achievement doesn't really inform them of like which gender is really smart. So where do they get these ideas? I'll be more than happy to discuss that at the very end. Okay, so then the gender brilliance stereotype emerged early, but as I pointed out, these are some data we collected here in the United States. So it might be like a social belief that's more specific to this culture, or it could be maybe like generalizable, or like we can observe that in other parts of the world. Yes.
Sorry, just a point against.
Yeah, sure.
Why did you choose 5, 6, or 7? Was it the no difference? You just suspect that because that's just preschool at school?
Yeah.
So really interesting, because at age 5 there was no difference. So why did you pick that age to start? Is it going to school a really important point in how stereotypes are formed? Is that why you chose 5, 6, and 7?
Yeah, great question. So there are like several reasons we chose this age range. Like one is that some past work have shown that children around this age, they become sensitive to some other stereotypes. So such as like who is better at math. And then they start to have some initial ideas about like which gender is better at math. So we're thinking, oh, math is a more specific type of intellectual ability, but then we are focusing on this more general type of intelligence. So maybe, if they are sensitive to like who is better at math, maybe they will have some ideas about intelligence as well. And another important reason is because children younger than age 5, they don't have like very clear ideas about what smart means. So yeah, in our, when we tested 5 to 7-year-olds, one thing mention is that we had some screener questions before they do the stereotype tasks, because in order for them to internalize these gender stereotypes, they need to understand the concept of like intelligence or like smart. So we ask them questions about, for example, we tell them like a smart children, and we ask kids, do you think the child is smart or not? And to figure out if they do have they have good concept of that. And 4-year-olds, they have a very difficult time understanding, and they feel like everyone is really smart. So yeah, so then that's another reason we chose 5 to 7. But in terms of the influence of school, I'll actually present some research that's relevant to that.
which between mom and dad is more brilliant to their mind?
Yeah, great question. I don't think like there has been.
I was asked to repeat.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
So is there any study that asks children which between their mom and dad is more brilliant to their mind?
Yes. So not with this like young age group, but then there has been studies with high schoolers, ask them to estimate their moms and dads like IQ. So how intelligent they are, like on a scale, and then they perceive their fathers to be more intelligent than their mothers. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. So then, yeah. So next, I'm actually going to show you like some data from other countries. So we found this pattern in the United States, but then we also we also replicated this pattern in China. So we went to China and tested 5 to 7-year-olds, and we found Chinese children around the age of 6 begin to perceive men as being like more brilliant than women. And we also replicated these findings in South Korea, but that's to the school point. So South Korean children, something different between like Korean children versus American is that these kids, they internalize the gender brilliance stereotype 1 year later than American kids here. So yeah, I was talking to some collaborators, the Korean collaborators, and they told me children in South Korea started school, elementary school, slightly later than children in the US. So this seems to point out like schools play a role in transmitting these stereotypes, but whether they transmit and how do they transmit, that's a question we still need to figure out. Okay. And some other labs also replicated these findings in Japan and also in Singapore. So with like in very different cultural contexts, children seems to like from early on begin to associate brilliance with men more than women. Okay. So then these beliefs might be consequential for young children, like since children already internalize these beliefs even before they adolescence or before they reach adulthood, maybe this belief will discourage children's like interest and motivation, especially leading girls to stay away from certain activities. So we tested this possibility with 6 to 7-year-olds, and this is the age group that they have internalized this gender brilliance stereotype. And for our young kids, we introduced them to 2 novel games. And in one game, we said, this game is not for everyone. It's only for children who are really, really smart. Only smart children can be good at this game. So you can see this kind of like parallel to the adult studies we ran before, but we couldn't tell them a major or like a job. That seems to be too abstract for our young participants. So we said this is a novel game, but only for children who are really smart. And we also presented another game set for children. This is a game for children who try really, really hard. Only hardworking kids can be good at this game. And after hearing about each game, we asked children, would you want to play this game? Do you like this game? That's like a measure of their interest to pursue this novel activity. And we predict that because at this age, girls were less likely to attribute brilliance to their own gender, so then girls will be less interested in brilliance game compared to boys. But then we would see no gender difference in their interest towards dedication game. Okay, so y-axis is the interest score. Again, boys are in blue, girls are in red. As you can see, for the dedication game, we saw no gender difference. So boys and girls were equally interested in this game. But once we describe the game as requiring high intellectual talents, only smart children can do it, then girls became less interested in this game compared to boys. Okay. Yes. Okay, so I'll just pause a little bit and then we'll move on to the next study. Okay. One thing I did want to mention is that, so these are with like 6 to 7-year-olds, but we also conducted the same study with 5-year-olds. And we found, as you know, like 5-year-olds, when we ask girls, they still pick women as being really smart. And when we assess their own interest towards the brilliance game, we saw no gender difference. So when you ask a 5-year-old girl, would you want to play this game? They were very excited about joining the game. So this provides some evidence that it's really like when they start internalizing these gender brilliance stereotypes, and then girls begin to shy away from some of the activities that they could otherwise really enjoy. Yes. Oh, sorry, there is the mic.
Okay, thank you. I just have some quick question, but did you control for racial differences in these studies?
Yeah, great question. So in these studies, most of the kids are like white, 70% are white. But right now, like my lab, we were replicating these results with like children from different racial backgrounds. And also in South Korea, so I mentioned like the emergence of the stereotype, we also measure like Korean children's like interest towards these different activities. And we saw exactly the same pattern. So the reason we went to like South Korea is because it's like it has like this Confucian philosophy, and also there's the culture emphasizing like you need to work really hard to be successful. So we thought maybe this message could buffer them against the influence of the brilliance message. But no, we found even like in this culture, and then Korean girls were still also show like lower interest compared to Korean boys towards the brilliance game. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So that's evidence for like the gender stereotype discourage girls' interest and motivation. And then we also wanted to look at if the gender stereotype can also give rise to some biases, even in this like young population. So then in this study, we tested 192 5 to 6-year-olds, and children were introduced to a novel game. And you have no idea what this game is about because it's a novel object, but then it gives us like the space that we can manipulate, or like, to manipulate what the game requires. So for half of the kids, we said this game is for children who are really smart. For the other half, we just provided no information about who the game is for. But in both conditions, we told children how to play the game. So then after that, we tell them this is a team game. So you will want to have some teammates to play the game together. And then we show them 6 pictures and 3 boys and 3 girls. And we ask them, okay, now let's choose some teammates to play the game. And the goal is to win this game. And remember, this game is for children who are really smart for half of the participants. And for the other half, we didn't provide this requirement. And children did this like selections for 2 novel games, but in the same condition. And then we looked at which teammates did they pick? And we coded the gender of the teammates. So we predict that in the context, children would show a tendency to choose teammates of their own gender, because there has been a lot of developmental studies showing that children at this age, they have very strong in-group favoritism. So boys tend to play with boys, girls tend to play with girls. But then on top of that, we predict that even though there is the in-group favoritism, children would show a tendency to choose fewer girls for the brilliance than for the neutral game, because they would hold a bias against the girls' intellectual abilities. Okay. So here on the y-axis is the proportion of choosing teammates of their own gender. And let's first look at the neutral condition. And as you can see, we did see like a strong in-group favoritism. So boys pick boys to be their teammates, and girls pick girls to be their teammates. And in the brilliance condition, we found this differences. So boys still chose boys, and girls became less likely to choose other girls as their teammates. So they offered fewer opportunities to other girls to play this like brilliance game. So in general, overall, we found the gender brilliance about intellectual abilities emerge early, and it discouraged both women's and young girls' interest and motivation, also give rise to biases against both women's and young girls' intellectual abilities. Okay. All right. Any questions before I move on to the next part? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is this finding so far, like every time like I saw the data, I'm like, oh wow, like we saw these differences, but at the same time, it's so distressing. Like we because these gender disparities already emerge like in early childhood. So our next question is, what can we do to really like potentially rectify the gender disparities? So if the gender brilliance stereotype is at least in part responsible for this like gender representations, one intuitive way to like address this problem is to counteract these gendered ideas about intelligence. And how can we do that? So language has been recognized as the primary means of transmitting stereotypes and biases. And in today's world, we have seen like a decline in explicit expressions of like biases, but then the biases can still be transmitted in very subtle ways, or like using like implicit language, such as this one. So when you read this sentence, girls are as good as boys at math, who do you think is better at math? Yeah, so even though this language, it's good intention and wanted to express like gender equality, but because of the sentence structure, it sets boys as the reference group and girls are the variant group. And often like when children and when adults hear this language, despite its good intentions, people perceive the reference group as having higher ability and more prominent and more skilled than the variant group. And even young children make these inferences. So what can we do to counteract or like mitigate the stereotypes transmitted in this language? So we consider using the power of hands. And I'm just so happy to introduce this. This is what we call the equal gesture, where you put two hands, two palms at the same height, and then they face each other, but indicating like placing two groups at the same height. So then in the next study, we wanted to look at if when people use like equal gestures, maybe children would not make the stereotypical inferences based on language. So in this, it's a very recent study, it just came out, and I'm very excited to share these findings here. Also want to hear your feedback. So we tested 8 to 11-year-olds, and we focused on slightly older children because this is the age range they become very sensitive to the language, the syntax in this language. And children were introduced to this like faraway planet, and we told them they are alien girls and alien boys on this planet. And then children received 4 trials. In each trial, they saw an actress, and the actress read a statement such as, girls are as good as boys at hiding. So what is hiding? No idea, right? So yeah, indeed, we picked this like novel words because we don't want children's any like prior belief to come into play and influence their responses. So we can now say girls are as good as boys at math because children already have ideas about who is good at math. So we used the hiding, and after hearing this statement, we asked children, who do you think is naturally better at hiding on this planet? Yeah, so we looked at whether they pick girls or they pick boys as having this natural ability at hiding. And I should mention, like we basically counterbalance like whether girls or the boys are the reference group, because we really, so then for half of the trials, boys are the reference group. For the other half, girls are the reference group. Okay, so then I'll show you the results. On the y-axis is their choices about who is naturally better. And the higher the scores means that they tend to pick the reference group. But then lower the scores means that they tend to choose the variant group. And when the actress just read this statement without gesturing at all, we found children in general, they were more likely to choose the reference group as having greater ability. So we tend to attribute greater ability to the reference group. But then the critical condition is when the actress read the statement and she also made the equal gesture, so saying girls are as good as boys at hiding. So even the sentence was biased, but then her gesture was putting two groups at the same height. And then we found now children didn't attribute greater abilities to the reference group. And in fact, they were equally likely to pick the reference group and the variant group. So the equal gesture was able to counteract the stereotypes transmitted in language. So you may think, well, yeah, maybe the equal gesture was powerful, or maybe these kids were just being distracted by the gesture, like they were not paying so much attention to the language that the actress was speaking. So then in our next study, we compared equal gesture to an unequal gesture condition. So in both conditions, the actress made some gestures, but then in the unequal gesture, she lifted her hands to different heights. But then in the equal gesture condition, she still lifted her hands to the same height. I hope these videos can work, and then we can.
On this planet, girls are as good as boys at hotting. On this planet, girls are as good as boys at hotting.
Okay, so that's the unequal gesture condition. And equal
On
gesture.
this planet, girls are as good as boys at hotting. On this planet, girls are as good as boys at hotting.
Okay. Yeah, so both conditions, she lifted her hands sequentially. It's the only difference is whether the two hands were at the same height or different heights. So then we
On this planet, girls are as good as
wanted to repeat more. Okay. So then what we see in this study, what we basically, like we replicated our findings, basically like children made more stereotypical inferences in the unequal gesture condition. So they are more likely to attribute natural abilities to the reference group when the two hands were at different heights, but then they refrained from making this inference in the equal gesture condition. So the gesture can be a powerful way to counteract the stereotypes transmitted in language. Okay, I want to watch. No, there was no gender difference in the children. Oh yeah, the question was like whether there was any gender difference in children, but we didn't see any gender differences because we counterbalance like who is the reference group. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sure.
Since you didn't present, you may not have that data. Is the gesture so powerful such that you do the opposite gesture? Does that change further down? Or there's a limit in the influence of gesture?
That's a great question. That's the study we are running right now. And yeah, I hope I will be able to report back. So my student is working on this study right now. Yeah. Okay. So do I have like 10 minutes left? To be cautious about time. Okay. So we do have so that's like we try to change like children's or like disrupt their internalization of the stereotype to as a way to protect all kids so they can so they wouldn't be influenced by the gender stereotype. But another approach you could imagine is to just motivate girls to pursue science, like empower them to pursue science. And there has been like several strategies suggested in the past. One strategy is to talk about the importance of effort as opposed to intellectual talents to be successful, which is consistent with the reality. Like, as I said, like many activities require people to be really hardworking. And actually, many of the famous scientists, they success because they just have like a bulb like light up in their mind. They work really hard to be able to achieve certain things. So then we suggest like emphasizing the importance of effort, then brilliance can be useful. And another way is to present female role models to our young children. But critically is how should we present our female role models? So there has been like many storybooks trying to do that, and even Marvel movies are trying to do that. Like they are like more like female heroes in these like movies. But then is it just sufficient to just read children a storybook about a female scientist, or should we do more? So in our studies, I'm going to skip the details about the studies so that we have time for Q&A. We found if we just read a book to our kids, it's not super effective. And what you need to do is to ask them to pretend to be scientists, to be doctors, and to be maybe a Batman. And then they will, they can imagine themselves as being a scientist, and they put themselves into the shoe of a scientist, and they can experience this new identity. And experiencing this new identity bringing so much more benefits, which is what we've found in our studies is that when girls pretend to be a scientist, and then they persist much longer in science games or like in science subjects than girls who just read a book about a scientist. Okay. All right. So, okay, my conclusion slides. So we have found the gender stereotypes about brilliance emerges early, and then it shapes young children's interest and leading girls to stay away from certain activities. But then maybe we can use equal gestures as a potential like effective intervention to mitigate stereotypes. At the same time, like ask children to role play a female role model, and then they can become more persistent in science activities. So with that, I just want to thank my lab. A lot of the work was done like by my grad students, my postdocs, and our funding source, and all the kids and families who participated in our research. And also thank you so much for listening, and thank you for all your wonderful questions. I want to hear more. Yeah. Yes.
Great. I have about 3 questions from no, now it's on. We have 3 questions from online. Can you share more details about the demographics of the undergrad student participants in the brilliance versus dedication study?
Yeah, sure. So these were like, they were gender balanced, like in our studies, but also it's quite, so when we tested undergrads, I would say like most of the students were like were white, but then we also, we recruited participants from Amazon M-Turk and also Prolific. So these were like more diverse populations that we intended to have. And the results were pretty much the same.
Okay. Our second question from online is, for the choosing teammates study, did you also ask the students about choosing teammates for a game where you have to be very, very nice?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. We didn't have this condition, but my prediction would be like children will be more likely to choose girls because nice is, from early on, they attribute niceness to girls more to boys. Yeah.
Great. And then our last question from online right now is, if assuming that school may be contributing to this gender bias, do we know if kids who are homeschooled also show this bias?
Oh, great question. I wish I have a sample of these kids, but that's a great question. So, as we were discussing this in the faculty meeting just now, it's basically like the children's internalization of the stereotypes are like multi-sourced. It's not like one source is responsible for their entire endorsement. So schools play a role, but at the same time, parents may play a role as well. And indeed, in our ongoing studies, we found, so we coded parents' responses to boys and girls' failures when they, like in their academic pursuits or like some other pursuits. And we found parents tend to ask boys to be more persistent. And then they feel girls are fragile, and they tend to comfort girls more and try to redirect them more often compared to boys. And the critical thing is like young children are super sensitive to these messages. So we presented these 2 types of messages to our young kids, and we asked them, okay, one child failed, but then the adult said like, you should keep working on it. Well, versus another child failed, but then the adult said, oh, why don't you try something else? Maybe you are good at something else. And we asked children who is really smart when they saw these 2 different versions, and they feel like the one who received persistence message is smarter, and which are the boys, they tend to pick, they are the receivers of this message. So So basically, like schools play a role, but we should also be aware, like also the home environments may also like play a role in this process. And yeah, it's just like a very, it's a multifaceted transmission of these gender stereotypes. I think she had a question.
So it's more of an affirmation of your research than a question.
Yeah.
So I have two daughters. Excuse me. I have two daughters, and they're both in college right now. And they were that very first slide where you had the neuroscience on one end and then computer science on the other. Those are my daughter's two majors.
Oh.
So one is on one end and one is on the other end. You know, when I think about like, how did I raise two girls that are both in science? And I think back, you know, when you just had that slide and you showed the picture of the girl with the petri dishes and all of that.
Yeah.
I was like, oh yeah, we used to do this. We had this like science experiment kit with goggles and everything. And I still remember my daughters with their pigtails running around with the goggles on saying, I'm a science girl. I'm a science girl.
Great.
And so I guess maybe that had obviously I did it consciously because I wanted them to, you know, we were very science heavy and it was very important in our home. But maybe that did have something to do with them ending up on your very first slide. By the way, I also did homeschool them for like the first year. The youngest was like preschool homeschooling and the second was like kindergarten homeschooling. So still very young, but I don't know. I mean, just to add that to, you know, the blend of statistics. So I just this is my own personal affirmation of your research.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, certainly. I feel like for us, like we also, it's like a very short dose, I would say. Like we just ask them to pretend to be the scientist for a very brief period of time. And then we see like growth benefit from that. Even like in challenging tasks, they just want to stay longer. And then we ask them like, who were you like when you were playing these games? And they were like, I'm Dr. Marie Curie. So that's the female role model we showed to them. Yeah.
I just had a quick question about why the hand gestures, the equal hand gestures is why you chose that. And does it have a relationship to the 8-year-old developmental?
Oh, yeah.
ability?
So yeah, choosing this like older age range is mostly because of the language development. So these kids, the sentence we use, girls are as good as boys. Children, like at this age, they become sensitive to this syntax. And then they make the inference that if the boys are the reference group, and then they have like greater abilities. But younger children, like 5 and 6-year-olds, they don't necessarily make these inferences. And the gesture is because the reason we chose this is because like there has been some studies with adults is for us, when we gesture on this vertical level, many times it means something related to competence. So the vertical level, like in our perception, it's associated with like somebody's like competence or like something's capabilities. So then we were thinking, oh, if this vertical level is associated with like competence, putting these two groups at the same level on the vertical axis means that they are equal in terms of their competence. Yeah.
Well, I think we should wrap up, but if I may ask a quick question. Well, I wanted to say one thought about the dressing up. What does it say? You know, unfortunately, our daughters don't spend a lot of time dressing up. As scientists, they spend more time dressing up with pink frilly and makeovers and so on. And what do you think that is doing to their self-perception?
Yeah. So like the initial step is encourage them to dress up as scientists. Yeah, definitely. I feel like, you know, the dressing up, they enjoy like pretend play, and children at this young age, actually we tested 4 to 7-year-olds in the study, and they just feel pretend play is a very fun activities. But then maybe we can just actually science is not that hard. And then we just describe it in a way that could elicit more interest from girls. And for a brief period of time, they could dress up and then just experience the feel of being a scientist. Yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Bian for joining us today. Very provocative way to think about the development of these gender roles that we know have these long term implications for our careers. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.